Hi, I'm Keith St. Clair, political science professor here at Grand Rapids Community College. I wanted to talk to you today about ideologies. There's a lot of labels being thrown around today in today's politics, and yet I'm not sure there's a complete understanding of what the labels actually mean. An ideology is a philosophy on how you think government ought to govern. And there's a consistency to it, there's a logic to it that makes it predictable. So when someone tells you their ideology, you have an idea of where they might stand on a range of issues. And there's a whole spectrum of ideologies that we could discuss, and I'll try to touch on many today. Of course, the most popular ones traditionally here in the United States have been the liberal and conservative ideology. And we say that the liberals are to the left of the conservatives. And this is, well, it really comes to us from the French. The idea of left and right politics dates back to the 19th century. And it has to do with where the French sat in the National Assembly at that time. And people of like mind sat together. So those who sat to the speaker's left believed certain things, and those who sat to the speaker's right believed other things. And from today's perspectives, the liberals would have been to the right, or excuse me, the liberals would have been to the left of the conservatives. The conservatives would have been to the right of the liberals. There's not, I guess there's not any logic to why the liberals are on the left. It was just really more of a historical accident. But the terminology stuck, and we still use it today, as a matter of fact. And so at that time, the French National Assembly sat in a half circle, and the speaker would have stood here, everyone to the left, but basically a fairly centrist point of view would have been the liberals, and the conservatives today would have been to the right. On the extreme lefts, on the extreme left, you would have had what we would today call then it was called the anarchists, but you don't really know many anarchists today. Anarchists believed that there really shouldn't be any government whatsoever. They kind of wanted to do away with government and were very radical as a result. On the extreme right, you would have had the monarchists. The monarchists, as the name implies, were those who wanted to have a king and preserve the monarchy. And again, you don't meet many anarchists or monarchists today. But what we do have today on the extreme left and extreme right, we have on the extreme left the communists, and on the extreme right, the fascists. The communists, well, I guess as a tease, I'll tell you that as you probably already know, believe in a violent revolution to overthrow the business class as a means to more equitably distribute the wealth of society so that everything should be shared in common, that this had to happen violently, and that eventually there wouldn't be any need for government. So in that sense, they might have shared that utopian future with the anarchist. On the extreme right, the fascist, they believed in one leader for one culture, for one country. The Nazis are a great example of a fascist party who believed in Germany for the Germans. If you weren't German, then you were to get the hell out. And they were to have one leader, and that leader, the Führer, was Adolf Hitler. Certainly we have extremism in the United States, and in fact, I think we're seeing a rise in extremism in the United States. But traditionally, our ideologies that have been embraced by most Americans have been fairly moderate. And I'd like to take a look at those to begin with before we look in more detail at the extremes. We'll start with the conservatives. Now, in describing these ideologies, I am going to overgeneralize. I find that somewhat unavoidable, really. I'm going to boil all issues down into two main issue areas. One would be economic issues on what the government should do with the economy. The other being social or lifestyle choice issues. And I know that is an overgeneralization, but it really can't be helped as far as getting a grasp of what these ideologies are about. When it comes to the conservatives, we'll start with the economy. The conservatives believe that when it comes to having a healthy economy, the best thing that can be done on the part of the government is nothing. That the government really should stay the heck out of the way. Let the free market work. Laissez-faire economics. Let the law of supply and demand determine price. People will basically vote with their dollars for what they want to see produced. Successful businesses will attract those dollars and thrive. Inefficient businesses will not, and therefore will go out of business. And that is as it should be from the conservative point of view. And the result, say the conservatives, is the most productive and efficient economy that can be hoped for. And that even if the wealth is divided or not shared equally, that's beside the point. The fact is, our society will be the most wealthy for it, and that even those who are less well off will be better off than if we had pursued another course. When it comes to lifestyle choice issues, this is really where conservatives believe the government needs to be involved. Because from a conservative point of view, there's a right way to live and there's a wrong way to live. And the right way to live is very constructive for society, both the individual and society. And the wrong way to live is very destructive for both the individual and society. And government needs to be there to encourage people to live the most constructive life. And that society as a whole will be better off if that is done. And so the government is ideally placed to be a model for what is correct behavior, what is the right way to live. And an example would be, well, for example, when it comes to raising children, conservatives believe that the best and optimal way to raise children is within the confines of marriage. Marriage between a man and a woman. And that since sex leads to children, sex really should be reserved and encouraged for those who are married and discouraged for those who are not. And the government can play a role there as well. But marriage is to be between a man and a woman because every child, as conservatives say, needs a father and a mother, and that this is the best way to raise children. Therefore, marriage should not be for two men or two women, because homosexuality, from a conservative point of view, does not lead to the procreation of children, and it only spreads disease. Homosexuality, therefore, from the government's point of view, is an activity that should be discouraged. When it comes to abortion, conservatives believe that abortion is the killing of the unborn, and therefore a society that kills its unborn, its next generation, is not a society that's going to be sustainable. It's not a society that's going to embrace the correct values that are going to encourage life. Therefore, the government should restrict or ban abortion outright for that reason. Conservatives also believe that when it comes to illicit drug use, heroin, cocaine, marijuana, alcohol, all of these things are in essence vices that are self-destructive on some level and therefore need to be restricted or in some cases banned. People in essence need to be protected from themselves. They shouldn't be allowed to become addicted. That's not a choice that the government should allow to be made. When it comes to prostitution should be illegal, say the conservatives. women should not be, or men, should not be allowed to sell their bodies for sex, that this is self-destructive behavior, and it's the government's duty to protect us from making those bad decisions. Also true would be for gambling. Gambling, I as an individual shouldn't be allowed to gamble all my money away, my life savings. The government needs to protect me from that bad choice and discourage it, restrict it, if not make it illegal. So these are the positions of the conservative ideology. And as you can imagine, the liberals take the opposite point of view. I see there's a question about libertarians. We'll be addressing that shortly. Thank you for staying tuned. When it comes for liberals to managing the economy, this is where liberals say the proper role of government is. That the government needs to be or play the role of a referee. From a liberal point of view today, if you let the free market work, laissez-faire economics, you end up, the result is very few wealthy people and a lot of poor people, as those who become very adept at acquiring wealth exploit the others. And so the government needs to play the role of a referee, a Robin Hood, if you will, taxing the wealthy more in order to redistribute some of that wealth to the poor, providing a social safety net below which the most destitute cannot fall. Right? So this is where the liberals see the proper role of government, right? The government should provide set a minimum wage beneath which no one should be allowed to work because it is perceived to be exploitative, right? The idea that businesses will exploit both the consumer and the workers. And the government is in an ideal position to provide safe working conditions, standards for businesses that businesses have to comply with, testing products and making sure that products are not sold that are hazardous to the consumer public as a whole. This is really where the government needs to be involved, say the liberals. When it comes to lifestyle choice issues, this is where the liberals say the government doesn't need to be involved, right? Little or no role for the government here. Let people in a free society live the life that they choose. From a liberal point of view, there is no right way to live or wrong way to live that the government can divine and encourage for its people. Really, that's for people in a free society to decide for themselves. Going back to the examples I previously used, liberals believe that there isn't necessarily one right way to raise a child, that a single woman who wants to have a child on her own outside of marriage could be a perfectly fine mother and should be allowed to do it. This behavior shouldn't be discouraged. Right? Or if people don't want to get married at all, that's entirely fine as well. From a liberal point of view, if people want to get married, they'll get married. If they don't want to get married, they won't get married. The government doesn't need to be encouraging marriage, right? By providing tax breaks, for example, that married people have that single people don't. This is for the individual to make, not something that the government needs to encourage or discourage. And when it comes to marriage, for that matter, liberals were more open to the idea that two men or two women could get married and should be able to get married, and perhaps adopt children if that is their option. There is no one ideal family, say the liberals, from that point of view. And when it comes to abortion, liberals believe that the rights of the woman to control her own body supersede the rights of the unborn. And the liberals would say it's not for the government to force a woman to carry her pregnancy to term if she has changed her mind or if it's jeopardizing her health in some way. She should be able to change her mind and end her pregnancy. And it's not for the government to force women to carry their pregnancies to term. So say the liberals. The Tea Party, I see there's a question about that. The Tea Party, well, ostensibly was originally named after the Boston Tea Party because it was after Barack Obama got elected, there was a movement to resist further taxation. But I think it's kind of morphed into other things as well. Certainly at the time, conservatives embraced it, but the Tea Party is not a political party, if that's what some might be thinking. So just to clear that up. All right, so that's the, well, actually I didn't finish with the liberals. We also have, I mentioned illicit drugs with the conservatives. Let's talk about that. From the liberal point of view, if I want to indulge in heroin, cocaine, marijuana, alcohol, you know, even if these things are destructive to myself, as long as I'm just hurting myself and not hurting anybody else, I should be able to do it. I should be able to hurt myself if I want. I should be able to kill myself if I want. It's not for the government to tell me that I have to live my life, especially if I've determined that I'm in enough pain that I want to end that life early. Physician-assisted suicide, liberals would embrace that. Conservatives would not. When it comes to prostitution, if I want to sell my body for sex, that's my business. It's nobody else's. If I want to gamble and risk losing my money or possibly gaining my money, it's my choice, not for the government to be making it from the liberal point of view. Now, if I've outlined in both the liberals and conservative point of view, note, maybe you gravitate towards one or the other, but you can't necessarily agree maybe with everything that I suggested. Note that that's perfectly normal. There are very few people who are ideological purists and embrace their ideology consistently with no reservations, right? For example, I do know some conservatives who are fine with homosexuality, so they make an exception in their philosophy for that. I know some liberals who may not want to legalize marijuana. That's fine, all right, so they make an exception. Most people do allow, more than a few, a couple exceptions anyway, but they still see the value in adopting the label, right? When they say that they're a liberal and they say that they're a conservative, they want you to make assumptions about them, right? They're telling you, this is who I am, and they realize that you may not be able to then predict everything that they stand for, and they would disabuse you of where you might be wrong. But for the most part, they want to identify with that ideology so you have some framework on where they come from. In that sense, it's really not much different than someone who identifies as a Christian, right? These are, in essence, theoretical ideals. And then there's people's lives and reality, and seldom do they measure up to the theoretical ideal. If I say that I'm a Christian, I want you to make certain assumptions about me. But that's not to mean or say that you wouldn't be able to point out elements of my life where maybe I'm not embracing or following the Christian ideal. Those criticisms, I think, would be fair for most Christians. But they still see the value of adopting the label so that you know what their aspirations are, what they're striving for, and you can at least somewhat predict their behavior. It really is, the whole point of using an ideology as a label is to provide some predictability. You know, there's some consistency, there's some logical framework, philosophical framework that allows you to help predict where they stand, even if all of your predictions wouldn't necessarily be right because of the individual nuances of the person themselves. They may allow for some exceptions. So keep that in mind. Also, note that you don't have to have an ideology. Not everyone does. There's nothing wrong if you don't have an ideology. You can just say, well, I know where I stand on abortion, and I know I'm against abortion, but I am in favor of marijuana, and I like a minimum wage. Maybe there's no consistency whatsoever. Maybe you just arbitrarily like certain issues, and you know what you like and you know what you don't like, but there's no predictability to it either. That's fine. You could just call yourself a moderate or not having an ideology. There's many people who fall into that category. So an ideology isn't necessarily something you need to embrace, but is certainly there if you need it or want it, right? If you want people to make certain assumptions about you and you're okay with that, feel free to use the labels. Now, when it comes to political parties, note that political parties are not the same as ideologies. Most political parties will gravitate towards or adopt an ideology, but note that the ideology and the party are not one and the same any more than I as an individual who claim to have an ideology. There might be some inconsistency, right? But for the most part, in our modern political era, the Democratic Party, up until recently, had been the more liberal political party of the two. And the Republican Party had been the more conservative party of the two. And really this kind of dates back to, and really solidified, I'd say, in the 1964 presidential election, where you had the quintessential liberal, the Democrat Lyndon Johnson, running and defeating Barry Goldwater, who was the quintessential conservative and the Republican candidate. And since that election, those ideological affiliations, as we've come to understand them today, are really kind of solidified. And they existed before that date, but that was really where they coalesced quite strongly. But if you go back very long in American history, you can't, those affiliations don't necessarily hold up, because the political parties over time change their ideological affiliations. If you went back to maybe the year 1900 or 1901, the Republican Party would have been the more liberal party, and the Democratic Party would have been the more conservative party. So by 1964, they had completely switched their affiliations. But it is also a matter of degrees. I mean, if you put liberals and conservatives on a continuum here, and if you had all Democrats, they would maybe fall into this sphere here, and all Republicans in this sphere. And so some might be more or less conservative, others might be more or less liberal. And until recently, it was very possible to find maybe a Republican who was relatively liberal, or a Democrat who was relatively conservative. But if you looked at the two parties as a whole, the Democratic Party was definitely the more liberal, the Republican Party definitely the more conservative. Let me talk about the political parties. We're definitely more polarized today than we used to be. You don't see this overlap as much as you did. It's getting harder and harder to find any Democrat who identifies as being relatively conservative or relatively liberal Republican. I mean, Mitt Romney was a fairly relative liberal Republican governor of Massachusetts before he ran for president. So you might be able to put yourself on this continuum, but definitely the parties today have separated, right? The Republicans have become, or it did become, more conservative. We can debate really where the Republican Party is today, and I'd like to look at that later, but the Democrats became more liberal, the Republicans became more conservative over time, and the overlap became less and less. Now, if you're not satisfied with the choices that I've laid out, there are others. Someone mentioned the libertarian ideology. I'd like to talk about that as well. First of all, I think you've already seen how and why liberals and conservatives argue so much, right? They see things differently. They value things differently. Now, the libertarians throws an interesting mix, right? Because when it comes to the economy, they would agree with the conservatives that really the best thing the government can do is just stay the heck out of the economy. Let the free market work. Let business people do what business people do best. Make products that people want to buy. People will buy them. Will be the most productive economy because of it. And really, the government can only mess that up. The government should not be trying to redistribute the wealth through taxation. The government should not try to over-regulate businesses. From a libertarian point of view, there really doesn't need to be much of that, because from their perspective, the system is self-regulating. Libertarians would say that businesses are not going to make products that are going to harm people, because if they did, they would go out of business. Nobody would buy their products. Businesses from a libertarian point of view are not going to jeopardize or endanger their workers with unsafe work environments, because if they did, nobody would want to work for those businesses. So again, the libertarians would say it's pretty much self-regulating. The government's regulations don't need to be many, and they don't need to be intrusive. And the libertarians would certainly disagree with the idea of a minimum wage, right? From a libertarian's point of view, if I want to work for less than a minimum wage, if that's what I'm okay with, it works for me, my family, I should be able to do it. Who's the government to tell me that I can't? When it comes to lifestyle choice issues, the libertarians would say that, again, they would agree with the liberals on this part. The government should stay the heck out of the way, that a free people and a free society should be able to choose the life that they want for themselves. And it shouldn't be up to the government to tell people how to live their lives. If I want to have children outside of marriage, the government shouldn't stand in my way. If I want to marry another man, or two women want to get married, that's fine. Abortion, my choice. Illicit drug use, if I want to get high, if that's how I enjoy living my life, it's not for the government to tell me not to. It's not for the government to tell me I can't gamble or any other number of things. So maybe that appeals to you. Also, there is another option known as the populist, what used to be known as populist. When it comes to managing the economy, and there was a populist party in the United States, U.S. history in the early 20th century, but we're seeing a resurgence of populism now. When it comes to managing the economy, populists want the government involved. That the government needs to protect the little guy from the big guy. That businesses will exploit consumers and workers. Government needs to be there to provide regulations of business, need to be able to provide a minimum wage, protect and even tell businesses in some sense that maybe they can't take their factories out of the country if it's going to hurt the workers here. The government needs to be involved. The government needs to do big things, frankly. Right? Build infrastructure, that's important. Protect the border. These are very important from a populist point of view. From a lifestyle choice issue perspective, populists believe that the government needs to be involved here. Right? People need to be protected from themselves. Right? People should not be allowed to engage in self-destructive behavior. What is destructive for the individual is destructive for society. And the government is there to protect us from making those bad choices, right? I shouldn't be able to use cocaine, heroin, marijuana. These things are hazardous to my, they're addictive. I shouldn't be able to gamble my money away. I shouldn't be able to engage in prostitution. These things should be restricted or banned. So you can see there's quite a variety. And here's where they would fall on the political spectrum that I outlined. The libertarians would really be dead center. Right? The liberals would be to the left of them, the conservatives to their right, but still fairly moderate ideologies. The libertarians embracing laissez-faire philosophy really are really the ideal capitalists, frankly. Capitalism, I think, is most at home with the libertarians. In fact, really the economists would refer to this as the classical liberal perspective. Populists can lean either right or left, but more government involvement all the way around. Good question about foreign policy. Let me just say that as far as these ideologies I've described, it really just deals with domestic policy. Foreign policy is much harder to predict based on whether someone is a liberal or conservative. It doesn't necessarily tell you where they would necessarily fall internationally. Some would say that maybe conservatives are more hawkish militarily. I'm not sure that's the case. I think liberals and conservatives throughout history have shown themselves in favor of wars, maybe not the same wars, but when it comes to foreign policy, the ideologies as I've described them really kind of fall down. Some people might also, and again, I overgeneralized, right? I said I was going to do that and I did it. Some issues might be harder to fit in there. Now, some people have brought up gun control and say, why would the liberals be in favor of gun control? That might seem odd if you consider guns a lifestyle choice, but I'm not sure liberals really see it that way. I think liberals really perceive a gun as a product that businesses make that can harm people and therefore needs to be regulated, not necessarily banned, but regulated by the government to make sure fewer people are harmed by that product. If you look at it that way, it makes a little bit more sense. But I'm not going to sit here and pretend that, I overgeneralize, and I know that. But it's really the only way I can get through it. The more extreme ideologies, perhaps you'll find some of those overgeneralized as well, but I'll do my best to explain them. Let's go to the left and start talking about the socialist before we talk about the communist in more detail. Socialism believes in a more equitable society and far more equal economically than the liberals would be in favor of. And they believe that the state is optimally placed to create this more equal society, and that this can be done by the state through heavy taxation of the wealthy to subsidize the poor, and really the outright nationalization of certain sectors of the economy, certainly large corporations. And by nationalization, I mean if you don't know what that is, that's where the state actually takes a private asset and acquires it. The opposite would be privatization, where you're taking a state asset, a government asset, and selling it off to the private sector. Nationalization is the opposite. Whether, for example, Amtrak, when passenger rail service in the early 1970s was on the verge of going out of business, the national government saw the value. Even here in the United States, we don't pride ourselves on socialism historically, but even our national government saw the need to preserve passenger rail service in the United States, so they bought up all of the private companies and created a public corporation known as Amtrak to preserve that sector of the economy. And I think it's fair to say Amtrak, I don't think really has ever made money, but it is a private company, or it is a public company, publicly owned by the government, not by private interests. Kind of in a sense like the U.S. Post Office. So the U.S. Postal Service has always been nationalized. There's been some talk maybe of the need to privatize it. Certainly socialists would not be in favor of it. If anything, socialists would be in favor of nationalizing more things, perhaps the largest corporations, perhaps General Motors, Ford, Chrysler, Caterpillar, Apple, Amazon, these goals can be achieved depending on the socialists you're talking to. Many socialists do embrace the idea that they can be brought about through democratic elections. A freely elected government can choose to do these things. It doesn't maybe necessarily require violence, although certainly there are socialists who might embrace violence. Usually we'd refer to them as communists, which brings us to the next and the most extreme left ideology today. The communists believe that the proletariat, or the working class, has been exploited by the bourgeoisie, or the business class, as described by Karl Marx in his Communist Manifesto, and that this creates an unsustainable future that needs to be rectified and can only be rectified through violence. Right? It requires the workers of the world to unite and rise up and overthrow the business class through force of arms, because the business class will never relinquish their wealth of their own volition. Right. So this revolution predicted by Karl Marx had to be violent, and this effort had to be international and universal. Basically, it was class solidarity that mattered. It's not national identity. The workers of the world were to unite, irrespective of their national identity. This was a universal effort, a worldwide effort. In that sense, communism as an ideology is very internationalist, not respecting national identity. After a successful revolution, Karl Marx predicted a short period of what was known as the dictatorship of the proletariat, that the working class committee would basically run things until, as long as everything was shared in common, then there would be no need for government after that. Once everything was shared and shared alike, in a utopian vision by Karl Marx, there wouldn't be any need for government. And so in that sense, the lack of government kind of puts them in the same vein as the anarchists, who also were wanting to bring about no government in the future as well. So here we are on the left. Let's maybe gravitate towards the right. All right, so here you have the nationalists and then the fascists, a more extreme version of them. Now, nationalists, they have the idea that a cultural identity is the greatest justification for the state. That really the idea of the nation state, that a common culture for a common people with one state. And along with that comes the idea of cultural superiority, that somehow the pride in one's culture leads them to believe that their culture is exceptional, superior to others, and that's okay. That kind of pride is warranted and is to be encouraged. It's patriotism. They also believe that the state is optimally placed to defend the national culture, and that really the state needs to protect the cultural identity. And this includes really restricting foreign immigration, frankly, because foreign immigration only serves to dilute the national culture. And so that needs to be severely limited, if not, not eliminated maybe, but severely restricted. The fascists take it so much further. Not only is it the belief in a superior culture, but that for one country, but that really that is idealized in one single leader. That really the leader, the culture, and the country, loyalty to one is loyalty to all. These ideas become synonymous. The leader epitomizes the culture, who epitomizes the country or the state. It becomes one's primary identity. And really, it's really the politics of identity. Then, the national superiority, cultural superiority against other cultures who might threaten that, other nations or states that might threaten that. And even within the state, frankly, they will adopt slogans or clothing that reveals those who are loyal and those who can't be trusted, those who are loyal to the leader and those who are not. For foreigners, both foreigners are the threat to the fascist. Foreigners both internal and external. Foreigners overseas who are trying to screw us and undermine us from there, and then foreigners within our midst who are trying to undermine our society. And really every problem, in a way, from the fascist point of view, every problem that our society faces can really be boiled down to the foreign threat that's undermining us. And really that becomes the priority to be dealt with. Right? And that includes excising the foreign threat, including things like deportations of foreigners, as well as denying citizenship to foreigners. And in some cases, maybe even stripping citizenship of some who have it. The leader and his party become the arbiter of all truth. The leader is what's to be believed. Nothing else really can be. These things are kind of authoritarian tendencies that fascists embrace. But in some instances, you could say that other authoritarian regimes will embrace them as well. It's not just fascists that use them. But, for example, a free competitive media is portrayed as the enemy of the people. And this is to maintain trust, the sole trust in the leader. There can't be a free competitive press if it contradicts the leader. that the free competitive press must be perceived as lies, enemy propaganda, to be disbelieved. You are to disassociate yourself from this mainstream competitive media, and you are only to believe the voices of the party. That is the only truth there is. As for elections that don't support the leader are denounced as fraudulent and therefore corrupting of the state. Elections are not to be trusted. It's all about, from a fascist point of view, who's counting the ballots. And election results are inherently fraudulent, and that's even more true if the leader is not supported in them. And therefore, democratic institutions such as elections can be a threat to the leader, and therefore need to be taken care of, frankly. Violence is certainly justified by fascists. This is one thing that they hold in common with communists. Both have embraced violence as a tactic. I think that's why so many people confuse the two. Often I hear people accuse the same person of maybe being a communist or a fascist. I think the confusion resides in the fact that their tactics may be similar, but really their goals, remember, are completely opposite. Fascists are all about national identity. Communists are internationalist ideology. They're all about class differences, class warfare, class identity, and it's about raising up the working class at the expense of the business class from the communist point of view. From the fascist point of view, it's all about the culture, preserving the nation's culture, the purity of one's culture, that cultural identity. It's not internationalist. It couldn't be further from the thing, which is why the two hate each other, frankly. I mean, fascists and communists have fought each other throughout the 20th century. I mean, in some ways, you could look at World War II as being a titanic struggle, certainly in Europe, between communism and fascism, one that communism won. The United States fought, from that point of view, on the side of the communists and helping them win. But that's how many might view that struggle. Fascists will employ paramilitaries, not official military, but militia units that will deploy as needed to protect the leader and the party. They are not opposed to using violence. Chaos is often created to stoke fear and justify extreme measures. A good example of this was Adolf Hitler and the Nazis burning down their own Reichstag, the German parliament at the time, and blaming it on the socialists, right? I mean, creating the chaos and then stepping in to restore order. You know, the arsonist who then portrays himself as the firefighter. And of course, then that justified all of the extreme measures that the Nazi Party took. I think it's important to remember that the Nazis were elected into office. Hitler only became Chancellor of Germany once the Nazis became the dominant party in the legislature. And so Hitler very much came to power through democratic means. And of course, after that, saw very little need for continuing the pretenses of democracy. But that's really the seductive nature of dictatorship. I mean, I've been a little alarmed by what I'm hearing amongst people I know, students, or even just people I've met in the community. Somebody told me that, I think I could support dictatorship if I got to pick the dictator. And what they didn't seem to understand is that you can pick the dictator. That's why dictatorship can be so seductive. Why be frustrated with the need to compromise with your opponents when you can just bulldoze them? Part of the seductive nature of dictatorship is that you can pick the dictator. And presumably you could pick more than one, but easily that can come back to bite you, as you can imagine. But I've also heard, and Donald Trump himself has talked about how He could shoot people in the streets. I remember, and his supporters would still support him. I met people who said, yes, he could shoot people, and I would still support him. To me, that's frightening. Now, I'm not here to get into, some people ask me, is Donald Trump a fascist? I think the more important question is, are you a fascist? Is your neighbor a fascist? And if you subscribe to these viewpoints of fascism, if you really do believe that elections are fraudulent, if you really do believe that the free competitive press is just a pack of lies and you can only believe the party, why wouldn't you be a fascist? I mean, it would be almost illogical not to be, if that is your assumption on the state of things in the United States. This is my fear as I see extremism on the rise. So back to our spectrum, the right, the left. I told you how the terms left and right came to be. What can you say about the left in total? What can you say about the right in total? Not much. I mean, there's a huge difference between conservatives and fascists. In fact, liberals have long irritated conservatives by referring to them as right-wingers, as if to imply that they were fascist, or conservatives referring to liberals as left-wingers, kind of implying that they're out there on the edge with the communists. These are unfair and inappropriate descriptions. But yes, liberals and conservatives do argue a lot, but they don't really kill each other. Communists and fascists most certainly kill each other. They are historically sworn enemies. And I explained the reasons for that. But all I can say, you can't say a whole lot about the left in general. All you can say is that the further you go to the left, the more you stress economic class and remedying class disparity. The further you go to the right, the more you stress national identity. And that's about all I can do as far as summarizing the whole left from the whole right. But it's not really good to lump these moderate ideologies in with these more extreme ideologies that I think we're seeing more and more embraced in the United States, unfortunately. I think the internet has played a major role in that regard. It has allowed people of extreme viewpoints to find each other and embolden each other in ways that I think before the internet wasn't as easily done. I'm not sure that we anticipated this aspect of the internet, but these social networks have made that all the more possible. And one wonders what the likes of the Nazis in the 1930s under Adolf Hitler, what they could have done with the internet. Let's hope that we don't see this continuing. I'm certainly, I want to be on record as renouncing all violence. I don't abhor violence. I do not, whether it's on the left or whether it's the right that's doing it. There's been a lot of accusations by the right about Antifa. This came up in the presidential debate. Antifa is just a slogan, so that's not really a national organization, but it is a slogan that it literally means anti-fascist. Now, strictly speaking, that could be anybody who's not a fascist, I guess, but those who generally use the term Antifa are more out here on the extreme. There's many communists who use the term. There's many anarchists who use the term. And certainly some of them have been violent, and that is not to be condoned. Violence of all stripes should be condemned. But really the FBI considers the main threat to domestic violence in the United States today is really coming from the far right groups, the white supremacists, the American Nazis, the Ku Klux Klan. We're seeing this sort of extreme right fascist beliefs taking off, and it's becoming so emboldened that it's becoming very visible. And I don't know what pretends after the election. I hope that we won't see violence in the streets by these extremist groups, and I can only hope that that the next election brings some unity of some sort. I'm looking at some of the questions maybe that I didn't address. what's the name of the governing class? I'm not sure what you mean by governing class. We don't have a nobility, if that's what you're referring to, in the United States. I guess I'll just say that part of my worry is how identity politics kind of feeds into extreme right groups. When politics just becomes about identity more than about ideas, that's kind of dangerous. I mean, it's okay in sports, right? We do that all the time in sports. You know, as someone from Illinois, in moving to Michigan, I've learned about the rivalry and just how pervasive the rivalry is between Michigan State University and the University of Michigan, and it's all green or blue, and you know, it's beyond reason, it's beyond logic. It's just your loyalty is based on your identity. It's who you are. It's who your friends are. It's what you've done. You could take the whole Michigan State team of whatever sport, and they could all transfer to the University of Michigan, and they would not change their loyalty to those team players. They would continue to root for Michigan State. It doesn't matter who the coach is, or if the whole coach or the whole team went to the other school, it would be irrelevant. It's not based on anything other than just one's personal identity. And that's okay in sports. There's nothing wrong with that in sports. But when we start doing that in our politics, it can become dangerous, especially it feeds into these far right groups and their cultural identity, right? I mean, if we're just blue team versus red team in our politics, and whatever red team does, I'm for it, they could do anything, I don't care, blue team, same, then that becomes very dangerous. When it comes to our elections, I mean, we can't, the two greatest worries of mine that would really open the door to authoritarian regime is if the American public truly comes to believe that our elections are fraudulent and that our free competitive press is just a bunch of lies. If those two things are embraced, then what else have you? Authoritarianism is the answer if those two things are your true belief. Now, you know, fraud is very, in our elections, is really minimal. I mean, it can happen. It's rare. It's discovered when it happens, but our elections are legitimate in the United States, and I try to give that to my students. I try to impart that to them because they begin to wonder, especially, and we talk about voter suppression and how maybe some Republicans want to see a lower turnout because they do better, and some Democrats want to see a higher turnout when they do better because they do better. You know, that's all gaming the system, right? That's the kind of the equivalent of deflating the football in a football game, right? You'd still play the game, you still watch the game, but if on the contrary, if you knew that the results, the scores were rigged, that would be another thing. If you knew that the refs or the umpire were really calling the game, or if the key players were on the take being paid off, then the game's over, right? Once you no longer believe that the outcome is legitimate, that's a different thing. It's one thing to have these voter suppression games. It's another thing to actually miscount the ballots. Once that's believed to be the case, whether it's real or imagined, then our democracy is over. There's a question over why we have just two dominant political parties. All I can say there is that it has to do with the fact of how we elect people in the United States. We use plurality elections, where whoever gets the most votes wins, and we generally use single-member districts. For a House of Representatives, you win the district or you don't win the district. Other democracies do practice other forms of democracy. In France, they practice majority elections where you have to have over half the vote to win. Or in Germany, they have proportional elections where you're not really voting for the party so much, you're not really voting for the individual so much as you're voting for a party, and whichever party if the party gets 40% of the vote in the German national ballots for the legislature, then that party gets 40% of the seats. You know, there's other ways of conducting elections than the way we do it in the United States that would lend themselves to more key players, right? The rules of the game dictate the number of key players. So the fact that we have single-member districts with plurality elections lends itself to a two-party dominant system. Doesn't mean that one party can't be replaced. It just means that it has happened, right? We used to be the Democrats and the Whig Party. The Whigs were replaced by the Republican Party. Now we're become the Democrat and the Republican Party. But they were the dominant parties for a reason. And it's because the game is played the way that it is. You change the rules of the game, and you could have more minor parties playing more of a role, as they do in other democracies around the world. Anyway, so that's next question. And I'm all about reversing gerrymandering. Michigan has taken a step more than most states in that regard this last year, so hopefully we'll see less gerrymandering going forward after this next census. That's where gerrymandering is, where districts are drawn to the advantage of one political party over another. Certainly that doesn't, that certainly betrays the spirit of democracy. I would agree with that. The one thing I wanted to say before we left is I wanted to talk about the fact the Republican Party and Donald Trump campaigned as a populist and a nationalist. He may call himself a conservative, but the Republican Party today is not running or preaching conservatism to the extent that they used to. I would say that at least the rhetoric of the 2016 election for president, Donald Trump was engaging in populist rhetoric, nationalist rhetoric. For example, a conservative would never punish businesses for sending factories overseas. A conservative would never attempt to tell businesses where they should build their factories and where they wouldn't. That is not a conservative standpoint. A conservative would never be in favor of tariffs. That's market distorting. Donald Trump has embraced both ideas. He's embraced higher tariffs. He's embraced telling businesses where they can build their factories. He even called for a national boycott of Goodyear when Goodyear said that their employees couldn't wear his MAGA hats. So a conservative would never do that. That is not conservatism. And it's one thing that I've taken hope in, frankly. I have seen, the leaders of the conservative movement, George Will, David Brooks, others have united with liberals. And because conservatives, many of them have been purged from the Republican Party. We've seen that even here in Grand Rapids with our own Representative Justin Amash. No sooner did he criticize the president, say that he committed an impeachable act, than basically he was forced out of the party. Donald Trump has really it has become Donald Trump's party, the Republican Party. He's effectively purged anybody that stands up to him, and he has effectively purged many of I would say, the real conservatives. If anything, I would say that the Republican Party is more populist and nationalist, at least in their rhetoric. But I don't really see them living up to conservative values. And conservatives and liberals actually seem to be both anti-Trump, which is interesting to see as a political scientist over the years. I don't think I ever thought they'd get together. Well, I'm just about out of time. I want to thank those of you who've sent in questions. I want to thank, I'm sorry if I didn't get to them all. Certainly you can contact me here at Grand Rapids Community College, the Political Science Department, if you have questions, and I thank you all for tuning in.